Hi there and welcome back to the channel. This video set out to be a discussion of early apostolic Christianity and its origins, with a particular emphasis on examining traditions, relics and narratives associated with Britain's apostolic faith. I set out with the intention of examining aspects of this history in order to tease out political implications which are relevant for narrative supremacy in Britain. This does include some debate on theology, and I aim to approach this element of the conversation in a scholarly manner, and I provide the proviso that I am not preaching here, but am with an open mind attempting to analyse elements of our past which I hope will be helpful for those interested in studying the matter of Britain and our hidden history. Stay tuned if you'd like to hear more about the Welsh identification with the Israelites and how that might have shifted over the years, how Gnostic was the British Apostolic Church, when did Christianity arrive in Britain, and was St Helena of the Cross a British princess or a Bithynian barmaid? And if you're interested in these topics, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Hi everyone, and welcome back to either the Matter of Britain page or Britain's Hidden History, or wherever you're viewing this video. I'm joined with my dad, John Griffiths, and Peter Chesborough. We're going to be going over some of the stuff in this book where Jesus is buried by Wilson and Blackett, which was compiled by late Ross Broadstock. Talking about the research Wilson and Blackett did into early Christianity, the Holy Family coming to Britain, as well as some essentially theories about the contentions within the early church and between the Christianity we had in Britain versus the papal Christianity and the ongoing legacy of that. Wilson and Blackett make a list of very important points for discussing this type of this topic, and their list starts with things which, if you're not used to this work, can come as a bit of a shock. So basically, things like Linus, the son of King Cradock, essentially being the first bishop of Rome, Constantine the Great. Wilson and Blackett argue was always a Christian, and this is due, they believe, to his father Constantius essentially getting Lactantius, who was a really famous Christian teacher at the time, to be the teacher from a very young age in Constantine the Great's life. Also, the contentious issue of whether empire was given to the bishops of Rome in his will, essentially, after he died. So that's called the Decretals of Constantine. It's been confirmed as being a complete fraud.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a discussion that's gone on for a very long time. But yeah, I believe it is now considered a forgery, isn't it?
Yeah.
By most people, yeah.
Absolutely. Also, going into matters such as Empress Helen, the mother of Constantine, and she was co-empress as well. And you know, the issue with, is she a Yugoslavian innkeeper or is she a British princess, as recorded by the British genealogies, which is we go into the roots of the political reasons as to why that a smear campaign essentially happened to essentially drag her name through the mud to minimise her royal legitimacy, and also discredit, you know, the legitimacy of Constantine and Helen,
but also to dismiss the connection with the Holy Family that she belonged to.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think it's interesting. What did I want to say? I think even if you're, as you say, if you come into this subject afresh, whether or not you might be interested in early Christianity or not, it's interesting to understand as well that the story of Helen and the cross, the story of Caradoc and his family, the stories of Joseph of Arimathea in Britain are all part of the British culture. You know, it's been something that's part of the culture of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. All have stories about either Christ being here as a child or as an older man. It's not just limited to Wales, and it's part of our cultural history, and it's something that's been almost completely I don't know, like lost in our modern day discourse on our country's history and its culture, and and I just think, and that's why it really interests me, and that's what really gets me about it. So
I think it's been pushed aside as a fairy tale to some
absolutely
extent.
But what's wrong with celebrating our fairy tales? Where of the we're almost told that we've got no fairy tales in this country, and or they've become so mythologized that we don't see the historical interest in them as well.
Sorry, it's a slur, isn't it, in the sense of when you find it, the discussion leads down the path to saying that, well, you have to consider that it's not real, therefore let's talk
therefore it can be disregarded.
Disregarded. Talk about something which we think is real. So
absolutely.
Sorry, Ad.
That's all right. I was just saying that Wilson and Blackett mentioned how every country are allowed their origin myths, they're allowed their folklore, the myth or the narratives of themselves, but the British are not allowed. We don't permit ourselves to have that. And I think that's psychologically can't be healthy. Even to just hold them for what they might be, which is myths or fairy tales or fact. Yeah. And also when you find out that there are histories which corroborate and confirm the ancient British histories, you think, well, okay, with what veins of truth are in these fairy tales, and then you find out a lot of it is is not only confirmed by other cultures, but is retained better by other cultures.
Absolutely.
I've often remarked about how the Greek Orthodox Church remembers certain elements of our history way better than we do,
including Helen.
Including Helen, exactly. I think Helen's really celebrated in the Greek Orthodox Church, isn't she? And it's that they have a big cult around.
They remember her. They know who she is, and they regard her in the proper understanding that she's a Briton. But if you try to find her, if you try to see how she is honoured and respected, otherwise, you're on thin ground.
Yeah, definitely. And finally, one of the other points really worth looking at is the issue with Augustine coming to Britain. We had the coronation of King Charles III recently, and throughout the ceremony, it was presented to you often that Christianity came here of 597. Like they were hammering that home as the official narrative of when Christianity came. That's not even there's no legs to that whatsoever. It's only because we've forgotten our history that is allowed to go on unchallenged, essentially,
and uncommented upon.
So this is essentially the objective of this video, is to show that what we're being told about ourselves is wrong, essentially.
Considering that it's hard to get a book published, say, if an academic, you go to a publisher and you say, look, I've written this history, and they'll send it on to their academic, editor, who'll look through it and go, no, this is a load of rubbish. You can't say that.
Yeah.
But they can announce that on a BBC program they've spent millions of pounds on producing. They can say that, and you can switch on an episode of Time Team and see that's not true. It's not as if there's a huge propaganda campaign sort of, across all media or anything like that. You can turn on Time Team and say, oh, look, we're in a Christian chapel, probably 5th century, something like that, or we're in a Roman villa. It's got a mosaic with Chi Rose all over it and Christ figures. It's so bizarre that just even that they can say that and it not be. I don't know. Maybe the Guardian got a few letters the next day. I don't know, but we can only hope. But
I'd be glad if they did, but I'd also be surprised.
Yeah, absolutely.
Unfortunately, because this is the point in which we've gotten to, and we've spoken of before about this narrative of British Christianity and how associated it is with essentially the right to rule in this country, and the different dynastic tussles that have happened over time. So
I've just remembered something. Even recently with the new findings of graves near Cardiff. I think 70 graves.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
So I remember there was an article that they've just been found. Obviously, it's a great find. It's a wonderful opportunity to explore. But I remember there was in the broadcast, in the news broadcast, there was archaeologist being questioned, scratching his head as to why there'd be an east-west alignment to the graves, as if this was a puzzle. And I'm thinking, I can't believe that that's problematic.
Yes.
That's been presented as a curious feature.
Yeah.
So there really is a kind of cut-off in the understanding that Britain was, well, effectively the first Christian country in the world.
Yeah. When we first started recording these, John, we sort of badly covered a news item where in the old Elmet area of Yorkshire, so one of the last British,
that's right,
one of the last Brythonic kingdoms in England, to go, they found a Roman cemetery that went on past 410.
Yeah.
And the local county archaeologist said, wow, we've got a Roman Saxon cemetery, and there's crossover between the Roman and Saxons.
Bloody hell.
That's like the crossover. There must be a 400-year gap between them. Yeah. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. That's what we're dealing with. It's the British element has to be a myth and a fairy tale, and hardly real and hardly present.
I just wonder how much you can, with specialization these days, you can train all your life as an archaeologist and still only be vaguely aware of the Brythonic elements of your local area.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if
you're so encultured in your specializations, which are down certain routes.
Yeah,
traditional English routes, should we say? So, can I just ask about this point here, Adam?
Yes.
Could you tell me what happened in Gaul at the same time? So we got religious hatred towards apostolic Christians in Western Britain in the Second Crusade, exactly the same manner as happened in Gaul. So what was going on in Gaul at the time?
So basically, the Franks were basically made the mercenaries of Rome, and they were sent to essentially wipe out the apostolic Christians in Gaul. There's certain communities in the south of France, but the Franks were hired to do that earlier in the 6th century.
Because there had been a long-standing Christian tradition in Gaul as well.
Yeah,
from the early onset, and so this was a Christian view at variance with what had become the view in Rome.
Yeah.
I know that
it became a problem.
Germanus of Auxerre is said to have intervened on behalf of some Christians in Brittany on his way over to Britain.
So I thought if we're going to go after what an early Christianity would look like, which was essentially outside of the church, but also for looking at early Christianity as well. I think to have a look at the culture in which it came out of is important. Have a look at the three religious sects, the three main ones in Judea at the time Christ was alive in the 1st century, and just the 1st century BC and AD. You can distinguish them according to Flavius Josephus. So, we need to be aware of potential biases or bits of propaganda in there. But essentially, he outlays the idea that they're the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And the Pharisees, they have a kind of tradition of like an oral tradition, basically, and how to communicate law and morals and ethics. And this descends from Moses and his interpretation of the Ten Commandments. So they're very based in that kind of religion, which when you compare it to the Sadducees, they're almost completely different, because they believe in worship. All worship should happen inside the temple, essentially. And that the word of the law and interpretation and hermeneutics and those kinds of things are they're not as worthy as of living by temple worship, basically. So there's a difference between those sects there, and then you've got the Essenes. And I think the Essenes introduced the ecclesiastic basis for Gnosticism, early Christianity. And what the Essenes and the Pharisees have in common is that these people are present, after the Maccabean revolt. And the Maccabean revolt was it occurred to expel the Greeks from Jerusalem, essentially. And there was a bloodline of kings which emerged from that, called the Hasmoneans, and they were the kings of Judea in that period, but they were not of the Davidic bloodline. So the Pharisees didn't recognize them on that basis, and the Essenes didn't recognize them on that basis. But the Sadducees were essentially not bothered either way. They were happy to exist within that power structure. But the Essenes and the Pharisees were concerned of that Davidic bloodline, which for when you're talking about Jesus and him being, of that bloodline, it's an important element to bear in mind. The Essenes, then, they were a people who were very interested in and emphasizing dualism, which we recognize as something closely associated with Gnosticism. And this is the difference between mind and matter. You can see how that provided the framework for Christianity as well, because you have this idea of a spiritual life and a material life, essentially, and they're in conflict with each other, and it's your job to mediate it. Essentially rejected worldly lust, worldly pleasure, lust, anger, ambition, that sort of thing. And they're opposed to riches, and they're opposed to essentially materialism.
Yeah.
And they appeared to have lived in a kind of communal kind of setting, and they didn't own anything. They didn't own their own clothes. They didn't, they shared everything, basically. They were dualists, and they weren't as radical as kind of Buddhists, they really do reject materialism in every kind of way. You see monks who have literally starved themselves, and it's like they weren't quite there, but they weren't far off.
And it sounds much like the description of how Jesus and the disciples lived, and especially something like Gospel of Matthew as well, which is very anti-wealth and possessions in particular.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
the concept of a illegitimate kingly bloodline in Judea was that was completely against what they would prefer. Essentially, they prefer the correct and spiritual bloodline to be on the kingly bloodline. So they rejected the Hasmoneans for that. Yeah, as Peter said, this is kind of where we get into the conversation of, was Jesus an Essene? And the British tradition definitely has, because Joseph of Arimathea is depicted as one, and also in the Bible it said that he's his uncle. So there might be a familial proximity to Jesus being Essene, and some scholars argue that the Nazarene is the same as Nazarite, which is a word for people who are separated and who perform certain rituals of purification, basically. and they go through that kind of purification of the soul, kind of.
Which sounds like the Essenes.
Sounds like the Essenes, right?
Yeah, leads us back round again.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've seen people argue that if he wasn't Essene, he was, in proximity to them. But this myth of a true and spiritual bloodline, or a true and spiritual king, I feel was very applicable to the narrative of Christ. So I think that's an interesting element to it. But also, was Jesus a rabbi? And certainly in this book, Wilson and Blackett make the claim that he is, and that's cited in the Bible. In John 1:49, Nathanael answered and saith unto him, Rabbi, thou art the Son of God, thou art the King of Israel. So you've got this Hasmonean dynasty, and then you've got certain groups of Jewish ecclesiastics claiming that Jesus is the Son, the true and spiritual Son.
In our understanding of things of who Christ was, when he arrived in the Holy Land, he wasn't recognized. He's an outsider. So the view with some people in that sense is that he was brought up somewhere else.
The missing years.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that there is a view that might have taken place in Britain, and that he might have been lodged among we could call it the Brits. We can read them as the Israelites, and in that sense, he's among his own people.
Yeah.
In Britain. So we've got this strange dichotomy of seeing the Holy Land as being Israel, and we've got also the place in Britain where the lost tribes of the Israelites had come to reside.
Yeah,
so
and
we have this double take, don't we? In the sense of who belongs where.
So odd. I mean, I've heard Bible verses since I was a child, and hearing Jesus being called the King of Israel always gave me the impression of it was almost like a metaphysical title, the King of the Promised Land, But then they're saying you should be King of Israel, and you are King of Israel because of your bloodline and your descent, and I just can't. The Davidic royal line at the time, whoever these people were, they must have known exactly who they were.
Yeah.
And I also think that the Hasmoneans knew exactly who they were, and they would have been on their radar.
Yeah, precisely.
I also think they would have been wealthy people and very well connected people, and people who could have traveled all over the known world at the time.
Which is the case for Joseph of Arimathea.
Absolutely, exactly. It's basically how he's described. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then we have this Essene link as well. I mean, what do we know about how royalty prepared for their religious roles?
That's right.
Pharaohs went through decades of basically being trained and what's the word I'm looking for? Sculpted to perform certain religious roles, initiated as well. They were told certain things.
As similarly, the brides of the kings would be brought
absolutely, absolutely,
and made ready.
So would a male heir in the Davidic line be expected to basically go into religious service, such as a Nazarite and a Essene, whatever, if we can trust these terms, as you said earlier, Adam? In order to prepare himself for service as royalty, as a king. I think That's a
Yeah.
possibility.
Yeah, I think that definitely lends itself to this idea of the lost years of Christ, traveling along the Essenian links, which are set up. It was like a network across the Mediterranean and up, evidently through Europe, which is a community of a network of different communities who are in a religious proximity to each other, to have a syncretism of ideas and sharings of beliefs and different traditions, and that this is we've got this tradition in Britain where, because the Druids were in that proximity with the Essenes, that was allowed to happen essentially. Now, what is important, I think, with talking about this, and this has been mentioned before by others, that the Pharisees and the Druids have very similar schooling and process of schooling. It takes the same amount of time. It's a 20-year period, and they concentrate on laws, they concentrate on oral tradition, they concentrate on teaching, that sort of thing.
So the type of mysticism we sort of associate with these cultures, like geometry and astronomy and
yes,
mathematics and cryptography, things like that. This is all comes through very strongly.
Yes,
through the Welsh and the sort of Hebrew link as well. But we've only just started. I'm already enjoying this. Thoroughly. I've got loads of things to go and look at now.
Brilliant. So yeah, I mean, as you say, it's the there's Pythagoras, there's Hermes, and Hermetic principles. This asceticism as well, which is more linked, I feel, with the Essenes and everything. But all of these kind of notions, you can, when you imagine Druids or Gnostics and people like that, there's that pre-Catholic religion essentially.
Yeah. So just to nod back to our interviews with Marty, St. Michael is associated with Mercury, who's Hermes. There's a nice little link as well. Especially with thinking about geometry and geodesy, measuring the planet. I think that's
absolutely. And it's interesting that the notion of St. Michael and this battle with the devil as well, and it's very interesting how all of these ideas later by the church become demonized themselves. Anyway.
Very, that's cool.
Yeah. So going back to Wilson and Blackett and their take on Joseph of Arimathea, which is a very, very well known narrative in Britain, story associated with this Essenian link and the lost years of Christ, which you mentioned earlier, because between the ages of 13 and 30, I think, the life of Christ is unaccounted for. Or unaccounted for officially. There's other narratives in the world which you can infill and for it to make sense. So that one of them is this journey of Joseph to Jesus with Joseph to Britain. They give Joseph of Arimathea as being St. Illid, and St. Illid is remembered in the genealogy of the saints as a man of Israel who came to help establish the British Apostolic Church. So that's a recorded history of him. Other mentions of specifically a Joseph of Arimathea are in the Domesday Book, we've mentioned before, but the 12 hides of land given by King Averagus, and that is associated with Glastonbury, which is why that kind of thing is associated with Glastonbury more than anywhere else. The thing with St. Illid is interesting. He links him in with South Wales, where there's a church attributed to St. Illid, which is clearly on an old druidic site, given the oval shape of the graveyard and everything, ancient yew trees there, etc. Some people believe that's where he's buried as well. That's not what Wilson and Blackett believe, though. They believe Joseph of Arimathea is buried in Butte Park in Cardiff, when there's a grave in a church in Butte, in an old church in Butte Park. The church is not there, but the grounds are still laid out there. Where great.
So there's you can see they've preserved in the grounds of the park the outline of where the church would have been. It's quite tastefully done, I think, from what I've seen of photos. So you can trace out the what was the word I'm looking for? Foundations. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's two graves, isn't there? I believe.
Yeah.
And one is sort of roughly where the altar would have been, or at the, sort of right or next to it or behind it, which is the Bishop of Bethlehem's grave. And then the other grave is, what do they call it? The Wilson and Blackett describe it as the oarsman's position, the helmsman's position.
That's right. That's
correct. If you imagine the church as a boat, the helmsman would be especially someone steering with a big old-fashioned oar would be at the back and on one side, or sort of the left-hand side as you're looking down the aisle. And this is where they see Joseph of Arimathea as being buried. Does it come from? Is it Maugwyn of Llandaff?
I think historian. Right.
Yeah, a historian, called Maugwyn of Llandaff describes the position of the church and the position of the grave within the church. Now, the Bishop of Bethlehem's interesting. I think it's around the time of so Bethlehem was given a bishopric when it was first successfully captured during the Crusades, and when it was taken back by the Islamic armies, the bishopric was almost honoured by a Norman crusade leader, and he said, "I'll continue basically supporting you, paying tribute to you, but your seat will actually be in France until you can be put back in the Holy Land, essentially." And this position stayed open in France for several hundred years, but this bishop, for some reason, decided to be buried in this church in Butte Park, and there is no suggestion from anyone as to why he would want that to be the case. He had his own church with his own graveyard next to his own very nice estate in the local Norman lords paid for. So yeah, it's a really interesting little bit of history there.
St. Illid, right? So yeah, along with the idea of St. Illid and Joseph of Arimathea coming here, I think they represent, as I said before, the early Christianity which was evolving out of that Essenian link. But we've also got, the first century Aristobulus coming to Britain in the first century.
Dropped into my head that the whole point in that sense that Joseph of Arimathea is here because Britain would have been at that time the safe place to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When you think of what's going on in the Roman world, and especially in Judea, then really, if you wanted to be out of reach and out of danger, as it were, then Britain was in a very, very important place to be.
Yeah, but I just wanted to add this in about Aristobulus, in that he is recognised in the canon as being one of the 70 disciples mentioned in Luke. Yeah, so we've got this canonised tradition of a first bishop of Britain who died in Wales, which is maintained outside of Britain. This is a good example. There's evidence everywhere to suggest that Britain was a very early Christian country, if not the first Christian country. He's been linked with St. Paul's visit as well to Britain, which I'll go into as well,
and St. Illid as well.
I think you've got that kind of apostolic tradition, but I think you've also got there's another tradition which I feel influences the British Church, which is the essentially the Chaldees, which are, I think, the remnants of this old kind of Essenian, Gnostic, Hermetic, Pythagorean crossover.
Yeah,
Essentially,
I think they moved after the collapse of Judea. I'm not sure of the year, but whatever year that is it around 120 when
yeah,
essentially there's a collapse of the organization in Judea.
mm,
People got out essentially,
Mm.
and there was another migration. So
Interesting.
my understanding is that the Chaldees then looked for a place where they might be able to continue their practice and their worship in a place which would have them.
yeah.
What's the mainstream line on the Chaldees and their formation and their activities in Britain? And
Yeah, so the Chaldees are seen. If you were to ask a scholar who a Chaldee is,
mm,
and I don't think this is altogether wrong, but it might be missing a few parts.
mm,
I think what they'll say is that the Chaldees were they're Christianized Druids essentially, and the Chaldees have got a tradition which ended in the 12th century when
okay.
the Celtic Church fully came under the wing of Rome essentially. But they're described as hermits by scholars, hermits who essentially lived an ascetic life outside of um, mainly what's going on in society, but they did corroborate with the church, and they had communication with the church, but they did provide services in a kind of unorthodox way, but they're essentially um, leaning more towards this kind of Gnostic side of things,
Yeah.
if I understand, and I think that's what's presented. Um,
So they were an invigorating infusion when they came over.
yeah, absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and
I think I've got a stone which is purported to be a Roman stone.
right,
It's something I did about 3 years ago, and I haven't got it here because things are packed up. But when I translated it, instead of it being, it's generally recognized as a Roman stone, and it's a marker on a road. But really, it might be a marker for religious visitors to know that they're on the right road to get to other ecclesiastical
yeah.
Yeah.
places, and that in that sense, it's a welcoming signpost for the input of visiting Christians, and that might be Chaldees because.
But the reason I added this in about the Chaldees essentially is because there's possibly a very important maintained connection with that religion which came out of that a kind of a senior network earlier on and was maintained in Britain until quite late. Going back to John Sadler, who I wrote my dissertation about, he mentions that that Britain had a Jewish tradition until the 12th century, and what he means is that there was certain rites, there were certain things which they retained from a Jewish culture, essentially the Sabbath and things like that. That the
Mm,
British Church is being maintained by the Chaldees and in the British Church essentially. So there's a lot of conversation about what the Celtic Church would have looked like,
mm,
and many folks make the distinction that it was a purely Gnostic church, which I doubt. I doubt personally that it was fully Gnostic.
mm.
Potentially Gnosticism definitely influenced it, I think. But when you say Gnostic, what is meant essentially? Because we have a lot of our views on what a Gnostic is based on the Albigensian Crusade, to be honest, and the Cathars and those people who were persecuted by the church in the 13th
Mm.
century. Um,
Quite terribly so.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely, and we have to be wary of where we get that information from. Peter Devereux is who I'm most acquainted with. I did a little bit of that at uni, um, and he, the explanation for the theology is essentially it's reminiscent of this Augustinian mind and matter kind of dichotomy, and the origin myth of Gnosticism is essentially that Sophia, who is an ion in the universe who represents something like wisdom, one day chose to create without the permission of her consort, and she created Oath, which according to the sources on Gnosticism, that's who the Gnostics believed created this physical reality. And the job of a good pure Christian is essentially to transcend Oath and go past and go to the Almighty God beyond that.
Yeah, from the copy to the real.
Yeah, from the copy to the real. So that Oath essentially translates as Yahweh, and Yahweh is the God of the Old Testament. So what I would be expecting to see if the British Church was fully Gnostic is a rejection of the Old Testament and the rejection of Old Testament names, ideas, identities, which we don't get. And I'm going to go into a little bit about this later on, about maybe some did forget the Old Testament, or maybe some didn't, but there's essentially evidence for, or you can conjecture that there's a bit of evidence to suggest that was a tension within the British Church. We'll go into that a little bit later on.
Interesting.
But the Cathars themselves, they're described as being extremely radical. They go as far as not to eat any products of procreation, basically. So they're vegetarian because they don't want to come back here. They want to transcend and go back with the source God, essentially.
Interesting.
So they reject all notions of procreation, which is a very radical idea.
Absolutely, that is something, spread forth and multiply is a very important part of the church, isn't it? Yeah.
Very much.
Right, exactly. So it is an emphasis on the New Testament God, basically, and the rejection of the Old Testament God. So it's that. But when we say Gnostic, these are the people who we in popular culture revert to thinking about. So it's good to kind of marry this up with what we see in the British Church. Is what I've put that in there.
I think your description of the story of Yaldabaoth was interesting for me. Thinking about someone else who was very much into the British mysteries, does sound a lot like Blake's theology.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You've got
it. So you seem to come back in loops, don't you? So
yeah, back in loops.
I like your idea that there's possibly a tension within the British Church of certain more Gnostic practices and maybe a more Roman theological practice, which is, I say Roman, but I'm talking about the Old Testament as well.
That's it. Yeah, that's it.
And me and you, we also discussed about how we're trying to talk about what was the British Church, but what was the British Church at what time? Because
yes,
there must have been gradations and shifts.
Absolutely, and we know that thinkers were traveling from Britain to Rome. We know thinkers were traveling from Rome to Britain, and that's not just Welsh histories. That's in Roman histories as well. Pelagius, Germanus, Augustine himself. This shows a continual intercourse between the two churches, and it only seems to be through Augustine that it becomes a violent matter,
right?
Which I think is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by that time, the biggest problems that Rome seems to have with the British Church is the date of Easter and how they cut their hair. Which,
by the end of it, yes,
which doesn't seem too bad to me.
I think the cutting of the hair thing is. I've gone into that a little bit here. It's quite. it's quite a contentious issue for
Yeah,
to do with the matter of Simon Magus.
yeah.
Yeah.
Have you seen Old Boy's done a couple of videos on covering that as well, which are good if you want to get a good,
Yes.
very thorough. He does a very good thorough look at that. I think is interesting to look at.
Yeah. Yeah, he certainly alerted me to it. I'll put a link to that video in the
Yeah, it's a
description
great
as well for
one.
Old Boy's video. Cool. Right. So yes, another reason why I added the thing about the Gnostics in the 13th century is also because it's more or less contemporary with the incentive of Edward I, which is, you know, he was backed by the church to do this. It was essentially, I think, one of the big motivations for Edward to become the Hammer of the Scots and become the person who annexed the Principality of Wales is very much to do with religion. And
Really?
yeah, I think there's bits of evidence in that in the bloodlust that Edward I has got for acquiring certain Welsh relics. Because Edward wanted Arthur's crown. He said,
Yes.
I want Arthur's crown and I want the true cross. So he knew the cross was in Wales, which it is.
Mm-hmm.
And one was produced to him. And a crown was produced to him as well. I don't know if it was the real crown, but
No. And we've got no trace of if he kept them.
The idea that it was smelted down and put on the scepter is something which is very well known as a kind of
Oh, really? I didn't know
yes,
that. Yeah.
put on his scepter as a symbol of subordination to be put on the bottom of the scepter on a
really
kind of axis mundi kind of pole. You know, you're at the
yeah,
bottom.
yeah, yeah.
You know? It's psychological warfare at its best. So or worst. That would be an attack on the British. Arthur is a very big figure for British in a way, a big figure for British Christianity in a cryptic kind of way. I feel a way which we've mentioned before. It's crazy how they got away with it without it being essentially heretical, wasn't it? But
Yeah.
I think that argument goes very, very deep. But
yeah,
it's gettable. So in the sense, if we equate Arthur again with the Holy Family, and that is a heresy to the Roman Church in a sense, and for the British Church to be present in any form must have been difficult for them.
yes.
So from the get go, I think there were assaults on the British Apostolic Church in Britain, and I think we dug at one stone at Margam, which we translated, and we could see in it a message to Rome and to Gregory in particular.
Yeah.
Absolutely at a loss for why the Romans had the view of Christianity that they did, and that the family of Christ was present in Britain. And that text can be gleaned from the stone. So in that sense, the business and the argument was present all the time. So it may well be that we've unpicked that and uncovered that in the stone.
Yeah.
But that argument is at the heart and the root of all things.
I wanted to add this in for context to do with a kind of orthodoxy which was emerging in the early days before the Nicene Creed, essentially, way before even. So there was these ideas that there would be an apostolic orthodoxy, and from Irenaeus, essentially, who condemned the Gnostics. So this Gnostic attachment to, or Gnostic component to early Christianity had its critics from very early on. So, and this guy was operating in France, where, as we mentioned before, there's lots of these Gnostic communities, which lasted 1,000 years after he lived. So, going back to what we were saying about this potential tussle between ideas of New Testament versus Old Testament and the identities that go along with that. This was sent to me by Dad. It's a quote from Gildas in there we go, in the Ruin of Britain.
Right.
Got my copy there. So it's
what we'll do is
yeah.
that I'll go to the loo and everyone can pause it and read the quote.
Okay, so we've got this quote from Gildas, which is in number 47 in the Ruin of Britain, and he's basically expressing a great kind of despair with the Britons, and he's attributing the ruin of Britain, which is the topic of his writing, to the way how that they've forgotten, or you can interpret it that he's exasperated with them forgetting their Israelite identity, and he refers to them as the house of Jacob and the kindred of Israel, and he's basically saying that everything that bad that's happening to the Britons at the moment is because they've forgotten this crucial identity, and this is a similar sentiment which is expressed by Nennius as well, which he was more talking about the Trojan thing, but it's this kind of theme which re-emerges all the time, that the Welsh are always bloody forgetting who they are, and that is leading them astray. And but more than that, what this also depicts, and what this also offers rather, is that you have a group of people who maybe have turned their back on an old Israelite identity, or they may have forgotten, or the people who disseminate the teachings might have turned their back on it, and everybody else's subsequent result has forgotten. But Gildas hasn't, and he's expressing that as well, as these bloody people forgotten their identity again, and this is why we've fallen into ruin.
Yeah.
So that's a belief of someone who was in the church, or in the British church. So that could indicate a differences of opinion, and that could be related to the Gnostic component of the early church. Just an idea.
But
hear the word of our Lord, thou house of Jacob, and all ye kindred of the house of Israel.
Yeah. It comes across from reading Gildas, and I'm rereading it because I wanted to get past my first impressions, but is that it's the proximity to flame and fire and pestilence and plague, as a consequence of falling from the way, as it were, falling from a trusting God. Literally, it just occurred to me that what we have in the time of the writing of the book, scholars put it's somewhere in that window. And if we go to 536, that's the date given for the comet strike on Britain. And what we have with the narratives of the comet are, the strike, the visitation of God. You could almost envisage that we do have, in that sense, fire and flame, and pestilence and plague. Those things came in the aftermath of it. Always been presented that these, let's say, presentations of disorder and chaos were allegorical. But actually, we could step over into the real. We could just now conceivably say that, my God, he might have been describing the real as well, and actually seeking an explanation for it. My God, what had happened? Why has this awful change occurred, and why?
There was definitely a volcano eruption from Iceland, wasn't there?
Very much all these things again.
Yeah.
In the picture. That's right. So in that sense, you have, I think it's been posited in the past that it's been recognized that the volcano might have caused the change in the climate. Scientists have also recently dug into the ice cores of Greenland, I believe, and that they managed to locate within the ice cores a specific date of 536. And in the material that they've found, they've got particles which they've identified as, deep sea ocean crustacea. So what they're positing is that one of the things that came down smashed into the ocean, possibly the Atlantic, who knows where, but in the enormous explosion and in whatever was thrown up into the atmosphere, some of it was caught in Greenland, and it gives us the time, and it's exactly that time.
I mean, I'm keeping quiet because I think we could do a whole load on the comet. I think the 537 date, I think, is the bog oaks, the Irish bog oaks.
That's as well. We have we have
many. Wilson and Blackett had a bit of a disagreement with that because they thought it was a bit later. But then when we get into the 6th century dates, it all gets a bit fuzzy anyway.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that I'm pretty open to the fact that several terrible things happened in the 6th century, and that maybe a number of them were natural. Like maybe there was a volcano and a comet strike.
That's right.
They talk about St. Illtyd had to dig dikes around his land because the amount of times that he had floodwaters come over, and one year it was really bad, and they had to dig dikes all around the edge of the land. I mean,
we'll come back with a whole episode on the comet because it seems like there's enough there to have a few episodes basically, by the sound of it. Just going back to this idea of tension between New Testament sentiments and Old Testament sentiments within the British Church and everything. So that the Gildas quote isn't the only bit of evidence we do have. Thanks to Peter who alert me to this. Is this which book's this in, Peter?
This is in King Arthur Conspiracy. I think it's the 2nd volume. If you've got Ross's edition, the Britain to America bit, and it's the first section is called Back to Britain or something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
So again, this is related to their comet story as well, I think, with the migration. But
so it again is explaining the migration over to America in terms, as this is St. Tylo describing the Britons again in this kind of Old Testament kind of theme, isn't it? And a kind of exodus of the Israelites. So not the only example with Gildas. So this character you had mentioned before about the way that the British Church used to cut their hair. They're described by Bede as essentially cutting their hair in the style of Simon Magus, who appears in the Bible as this absolute, heretical spiritual sinner, basically, and sorcerer, someone who raises the dead, proclaims himself as the Son of God, kind of described as someone who is an awful person, basically, and there's this whole story in the Book of Acts between this tussle between Simon Magus and St. Peter, and they have like a showdown basically, and they have to sort of prove their holy authority, and Peter obviously abdicates his entire power over to God, and God rewards him by winning the showdown. And I think they have to get this little boy to stand up or something like that, and Simon Magus couldn't do that through, because he's not in favor of God, but St. Peter was. So that's the story in the Book of Acts. But I think what you've got allegorically, because it's not clear whether they mean Simon Magus, the person, although it is presented like that, but the Book of Acts was written in the middle of the 2nd century. So all of the things that they accuse Simon Magus of doing, that they weren't the things which Simon Magus said about himself in his great declaration. Okay, so this is an important notion. What they might be saying and doing is depicting Simon Magus as like an imago, which can encapsulate all of the heretics or the people that on the St. Peter's side of Christianity would deem heretics, i.e. Gnostics, Hermetics.
Yeah.
British Apostolics as well, I suppose.
British Apostolics.
Yeah.
So Simon Magus, and this thanks to Old Boy for his contribution on this. This really opened my kind of eyes to it, and in terms of how he's remembered in myth, and he's remembered by the Irish as someone who used to have crossover with the Druids and used to teach Druids basically. So it's very possible that he's a Druid of sorts. So the British Church, right up until the 7th century, I think, used to cut their tonsure in the style of Simon Magus. But then again, that is down to sources like Bede.
Well, then you got Bishop Oldhelm as well in his letters to Geraint. That's late 8th century.
Right. Okay.
And they're fairly well attested sources, but he calls it the tonsure of Simon Magus in that as well. Bishop Oldhelm based in Malmesbury.
Yeah. Excellent. So this picture here is of Dewey Sant who's had his tonsure cut in the style of Simon Magus. And obviously I'll give a link to Old Boy's video there.
Nice, yeah.
All of these points I've basically just gone over. So it's just this whole controversy of who Simon Magus actually was, who he represents in allegory, and who he represents behind that allegory, that image of someone who represents the old traditions of Pythagorean ideas, Gnosticism, etc. And how the St. Peter's version of Christianity wanted those ideas out of the church, and how that links in with a culture of establishing a heresy, judging who are heretics and who aren't, basically. Which goes back to Irenaeus. Cool. But one character who we can look at for potentially seeing some more ideas of what came out of the British Church was this guy Pelagius, who is responsible for creating what are seen as outright heresies now in the church, but were ideas which were popular among Christians all across the church at one point. And he basically preached this notion of no such thing as original sin, basically, and so you're not born a sinner, and also you have the right to decline salvation. Essentially, it's like a kind of libertarian idea, but almost. And that
if there's no choice, then you're not free.
Then you're not free to make the mistake. Yeah, absolutely. But key to that point is this idea and emphasis on reincarnation as well. This is how it links in with the Gnostic tradition, because the Gnostics do believe in reincarnation, and you go over and over and over again in your life cycles until you attain enlightenment and go back to God. So Pelagius says you've got to have the free will to be able to do that, to go through that kind of process of the transmigration of the soul through the stars and back into the body.
This is where the Bardic and the Gnostic beliefs overlapped.
Yes, absolutely. So you can see there that we associate these ideas with the Druids, as that's just said, and those ideas were making it into they were causing a big problem in the early days of the church, basically, and became a real heresy.
We've got Caradox family, Linus,
yeah,
Pudens, Yes. So Linus is said to be the son of Caradoc, and Pudens we can still find in. We've got the Church of Saint Pudentia is the oldest church in Rome.
That's right.
It's said to be, although I can't find the reference myself. It's said to be basically built on the ruins of the Palatia Britannicum, which was the villa built for Caradoc whilst he lived in Rome,
and where he and his family stayed.
Yes, and whereas and yes, and these people are meant to be who are being mentioned here in Timothy. It used to be Paul's travels to the west. Is your second? Yeah,
absolutely. So it's recorded that Paul went to go and essentially convert the Gentiles, and there's conjecture on to what the word Gentiles actually means. Some people argue that Gentiles doesn't mean just non-Jewish; it means something like nations or tribes. So,
people certainly works with gens as a form, refers to families, doesn't it? And
yes, and
absolutely. You find that across languages as well. That's not just Latin, and I think that's.
So he's been sent to find the lost remnants.
You could definitely see it as if he's there to round up the sheep of Israel, basically. And so when St. Paul goes through his travels through the West and into Iberia and Britain, that's how people see it. And some people claim that that is what he was doing, is rounding up the lost Israelites. And that brings us to a very interesting document called the Cennini manuscript, which is it's argued by some that this is the missing conclusion to the Book of Acts, which was found in a archive in Istanbul and said to be of great antiquity in an old document. Even I can't find how old it is. I can't see any information on how old it is. It's just said
the easy to find Wikipedia article, I think, says 19th century, but that doesn't mean that that's right. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
As you often find with these things, you'll get a very, just like, when was Christianity brought into Britain? 597 with Augustine. Dig a little bit deeper, you'll find an earlier date. Dig a little bit deeper, you'll find an even earlier date. And I that's what I found. But as I say, that's just the Wikipedia is not the best source for anything that's even slightly controversial.
No, absolutely. It was said that this was found in the 1800s, and it was old, but you can't.
Dating the actual manuscript.
Dating the actual manuscript is not anything that you have any access to. So it's totally up to you. And if anyone's got any more information on that, please let me know. I find it a very interesting document. Just it recites Paul's visit to Britain, and he's kind of tipped off to go there by the Phoenicians, who say that there's an island basically where the tribes are living, and that's in Britain, and that basically St. Paul comes to Britain. He sails up the Thames and he gets off at Ludgate, the area of the hill fort that was probably there, built by King Lud, and he preaches there, and comes across some druids, basically some holy men who come over and basically recite their Israelite or Judahite rites, and then Paul gives them the kiss of shalom, which basically confirms them as fellow Israelites. So that's an interesting document. We need to dive into a little bit more into that, but that's
certainly pretty conclusive if it is a real document. Absolutely.
Definitely.
But I've definitely read about Paul preaching in the far extremities of the West, and we still have one of the biggest and most important cathedrals in Britain, dedicated to St. Paul and built on top of a high point where he is said to have preached from.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah,
At
absolutely.
St. Paul's Cathedral in London.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's right. Something which doesn't appear in, well, aside from the document, Paul, that Peter's just mentioned, Paul is said to have, he's cited to have preached in the extremities of the West. I'll get that source up so we can see that as well. So from this document, it's recorded in all sorts of places that he came to Britain, basically. So going back to this is linked mainly with our discussion in London about Cunobelinus, and there's certain people saying that Bran could be the same person, or Bendigade Bran the Blessed could be the same person as Cymbelin or Cunobelinus.
Yeah.
Bellymow.
So this along the bottom here, my little video screens are blocking it.
Right.
So the oh right, here we go. Okay, so Cunobeline, Cymbelin, right, okay, Pendragon, King of the Scyther is on. So
the Catabalonian, the King of the Scyther is brackets the Catabalonians. What do you mean?
Yeah. So about this cross then, Adam.
Yeah, so this cross is actually attributed to Cunobelinus, which we went to go and see this cross
a couple of years ago
now. Yeah, 2 years ago now, in the Margam Stone Museum. And what immediately when on first looking at it, I was struck by the statement of how huge the sun disk is. It's you get sun disks in the West with crosses, but this one is huge.
It's pronounced, isn't it?
It's imposing. You go and look at it. It's just they're making a big statement about this huge sun disk. And when I learnt that this was actually it's attributed to Cunobelinus. It's called the Cunobelinus stone. It's something which, when we're talking about who Belly is and who Bellymow is, and how Wilson and Blackett give Bellymow as Jesus, there's a bit of crossover for me, which is curious, because we've got this huge kind of, it's a big statement about who, because the Bellymow was also in the British epos a sun god, and we've got a huge sun disk, but it's also it's got this cross going through it. So for me, there's a lot of crossover which is relevant to this discussion of, when we're looking at Jesus in Britain, who is he in the genealogies? And I'll find the reference to it being attributed to Cunobelinus, but it's a stone which is much later. I think they say it's 9th century.
Yeah, well off the mark.
Is that the writing in between the arms of the cross? Is that the inscription there, or is that more decoration?
That's the inscription. Yeah,
that's the inscription there.
Yes. Yeah.
Looks like more of that. Looks like that cursive style, from what I can see. I mean, love to look at that lettering and stuff. That would be up close. That would be cool. How big is it? So I can't really get a sense from the photo.
Probably stands about 8 or 9 feet.
Yeah,
really.
I had about 8 foot in my memory.
Yeah,
probably.
So about the diameter of the circle is about a meter then.
Yeah, easily.
Wow.
Huge.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I've just put my arms out. It's a meter, maybe. It's very close to it. Maybe
yeah.
Another point to consider with Bran and Cunobelinus potentially being the same person is that they're both in alternative genealogies said to have married Anna of Arimathea.
That's right. Yeah. So that's the tie.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, Anna of Arimathea is confabulated in the British mythological pre-Christian epos as the goddess of sovereignty. So that will be to do with the land in the old British psyche. So the land itself. So then you've got this incoming notion of Christianity from a kind of faraway place into the being married up with the land and sovereignty here. Which is a very mythological way of looking at it, but I think will add a bit of just another lens to look at this stuff with. But I found this old British proverb, which could also give us another indication, and this is in this book, St. Paul in Britain, saying, "Hast thou heard the saying of Hid, the saint of the race of Israel? No folly ends in misery. Hast thou heard the saying of the noble Bran, and the Bran the blessed, to all the renowned? There is no good but God himself." So we've got this.
Wow.
Do you see what I mean? It's kind of saying that this Bran person is delivering something like the gospel. You could see it like that.
Yeah.
Hast thou heard the saying of Caradoc, the exalted son of the noble Bran? Oppression persists brings on death.
It's very clear that these people are very central and very key for the delivery of a way of thinking, a way of living.
I just thought I'd throw this up this is all to do with the genealogies between this Highly character and Kimbellin, because obviously if we go to Luke 3:23, the grandfather of Jesus is this Highly person, or the father of his father Joseph. So this Highly does appear in the British records, and is referred to as Belly by Geoffrey of Monmouth, but this Highly is remembered elsewhere as Hylin, Hylias, Belinus, Dolobilus. So the confabulation between Helium and Belly is not something Geoffrey made up. It's actually something recorded in the genealogy. So
yeah,
but yeah, we have got this. You could say, how many generations do you think there? 2 or 3?
Yeah. We've got to be careful about the relationship going down. I mean, my understanding is that Kimberlin was fostered by Tenacius. He wasn't actually a son.
Yeah.
So it's not a clean continuance in the sense of father to son all the way down. Although they may well be related. So I've got work on another coin where I'm working on the names, and it seems to be implied as uncle.
Okay.
Or nephew. I think it's nephew is the word that's come through.
Right.
So maybe not father and son, but might be a nephew there. So that seems to be gettable through translating from what's taken as Latin into the Welsh.
Excellent. All right, brilliant. Great stuff. So obviously I'm working with the genealogies. Going back to that quickly, Beli Mawr is remembered alternatively as Bran, Belly, or Bran the Blessed. So those connections are made in the genealogies.
It's just the dating there which is problematic, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is just something we've got to distill out in the future. This is an ongoing work process. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, Anna of Arimathea is either the wife of either Belly or Bran. So another link. So we can't talk about early Christianity without this guy, Constantine the Great. It's given that he was in a kind of dynastic tussle with Maxentius, and was going to war with Maxentius over emperorship. And Constantine was outnumbered essentially, so he turned to God, and said, and then God returned by saying, "By this sign you shall conquer," and that is what's given us the point in which Constantine converted to Christianity. Wilson and Blackett argued differently in that Constantine was always a Christian. Given that his mother, if we're going by the British histories, Helen of the Cross, his mother was always a Christian because she was British. So, and his father chose a Christian teacher, Lactantius to be his teacher. But that in itself, that narrative, you can see how there'd be some people who'd be uncomfortable with that message. So you can understand why that myth is being presented to you. I mean, it's a really cool myth. I mean, it's definitely lively. But another interesting element of this guy Lactantius is going back to a conversation me and Peter had off air, and it's this relationship between this newly emerging Christian society and the pagan society, which is already there. So you had critics of Christianity, but that seems to be as bad as it was. It didn't incite a kind of violent reaction. And we'll get back to pagan critics in a moment in terms of Helen.
Yeah, it's interesting that there seems to be more friction. That's what I'm looking for. More friction between the inside Christianity, which wasn't one cohesive church at the time.
Yeah,
it was a number of
lots of schisms.
Yeah, lots of schisms, lots of ideas, lots of regional ideas and things like that. Much more friction internally than there is with dealing with paganism, other than obviously the Roman Empire and what religion you're allowed to practice. But in terms of Druidism in Britain, that we don't seem to have any evidence of any friction between Christianity and Druidism.
No.
The sole example I can think of is stories from Lives of the Saints about when a saint comes along and sets up his area and the locals don't like it. But these all just seem like later additions in trying to prove the steadfastness of the spirit.
The new church.
Absolutely. And but there's nothing or physical archaeological evidence about the friction between Christianity and
seems to have been a seamless change.
The threat seems to come from the Roman authorities alone. And emperor worship.
Wow, because they did see themselves as gods, and it's going to be a difficult crossover for them, isn't it?
Yeah.
For that culture.
Well, it's really complex because there's a sense of if you're a Roman emperor of allowing yourself to consider yourself to be a god and conferring that upon yourself. So that seems to be done. There are many examples of that happening.
Yeah.
In the case of Constantine, it could be argued that actually he isn't descent of the Holy Family. And in that sense, he could say that he's the fulfillment of a tradition or of a bloodline.
Yeah.
So
through his mother.
Yeah. So you have competing allowances.
Yes. Yeah. And going on from Constantine and his mother, there's this whole issue to do with competing theories on who she was and where she came from. And one of them, which the one that has stuck and has remained, I think one thing that won't get much mention, and one thing which will ruffle feathers for some is the fact that you can trace a kind of defamation of character or a smear campaign back to this guy Zosimus, who was a very disappointed Greek pagan who was very disappointed with the fact that the empire was becoming Christian, basically. And even in the writings of Zosimus, he writes about Helen being the idea that Helen's a British princess, which he essentially writes to then scoff at, basically. He said, no, she was a barmaid from Bithynia who Constantius fell in love with on his way out, through Yugoslavia. And
so he actually quotes both traditions, does he?
Yes.
Really? That's interesting.
Wow, yeah.
So that's in the Holy Kingdom. Adrian
right.
Gilbert, Wilson and Blackett, which was it's also in Cambrian triumphans as well. So that if you've got that, you can have a look in there. So it's a thing which, yeah, even when because he's quoting both traditions, you have to include that in the argument. And the competing theory is that she's not a barmaid at all. She's in fact the granddaughter of King Cole II
Yeah.
of Colchester.
But
And
what I noticed when I was looking at the Roman emperors and looking at their marriages and wives and what the marriages were about, generally speaking, this would be very atypical for an emperor to marry a barmaid. Normally, they're very strong power marriages between families, if not, strong opponents. So you've got a very strange nestling here of a situation which goes against type, as it were.
yeah, absolutely.
There's an idea that Constantius only came to Britain towards the end of his life or something like that, so he didn't have this. But I think you've made the right point here, John. What's the likelihood of a Roman emperor marrying a commoner?
Wouldn't he just have? He might have accommodated it in another way.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to point out is that this would not be the first Roman emperor to take a British wife a British princess for a wife. Severus has already done this previously in the previous century, and would then happen again as well in future.
Yeah,
with
another Helen.
Yeah,
as well.
Yeah,
a daughter of Udaf Hen, who married Magnus Maximus.
That's right. One of his.
And also, I love the name, the way that Helen crops up in British history. Again, harking back to Troy as well. I think that's a nice little link.
Yeah. Brilliant. Nice point. But we can't talk about Helen, of course, without talking about Nevern, which I woke up in my bed at about 1 o'clock in the morning the other day, and I was just had this urge to go and drive there because I thought I'm just so enthused with it at the moment. It's so incredible that you've got this place there, this place which was once a very important pilgrimage site, and you can go and see that with the way that pilgrims have stood on the bottom stone there, and feet marks have been worn into it. So this was a very important Christian pilgrimage place once. And
polished the stone in, isn't it? It's polished the stone where they've stood. Yeah,
absolutely. And it wasn't until Wilson and Blackett that this place was actually made a scheduled monument because they raised the awareness. And it's like, well, that's again another relic of ours which has just been discarded and forgotten. Wilson and Blackett say that if you put a metal detector to this wall, that there is a casket inside, or there's a ferrous metal,
something that can be registered.
So there's the idea is that this isn't just a face of a face of a rock. This is actually a cave, and it's sort of been built up, which it certainly looks like.
Yeah, you can sort of see that the top half of the cross is carved out of the stone, and the bottom half, and you can see off to the right as well, some sort of shale, slaty type rock has been used to build up the cave wall, the cave mouth. Sorry.
Absolutely.
And the cross is. They make the point that the cross has been brilliantly done. You couldn't just quickly knock down the wall and get it rebuilt by your local farmer's dry stone walling company, because of this lovely little bit of artistry with the cross. You have to get the right rocks back in the right place, so no one's sneaking anything in and out.
Absolutely.
Nice.
And it's just an amazing part of history. We must go and see it this year.
Absolutely. And the way it connects to a star map as well.
Right.
Is
Yeah.
very interesting.
And
Indeed.
yes, absolutely. This is a very important element to our conversation of the early British Church as well, because we can see the co-emperorship of Constantine and Helen as being a point which was, we've got the Nicene Creed in their reign, okay, which is the first Council of Nicaea, which is the first of, I think, 8 or so very important councils held by the early church, to essentially establish what is going to become the orthodoxy, okay. And the first one is held by Constantine, but these people are operating from an island which has clearly got a very ancient connection to Christianity, but also there's this pre-Christian notion of cross symbolism within the landscape, and this is a good example, because here we've got cromlechs and dolmens which are aligned in the maps, which when you connect them up, they create this cross image which you can see here. But the Nevern cross is right in the heart of it, and that is something which comes from these dolmens and these cromlechs come from a culture which is pre the 1st century, isn't it, by a long way?
Absolutely. Oh yeah.
So
the dolmens are meant to be one of the oldest aspects of the megalithic culture as well. So yeah, I mean, it's worth just we're not just looking at a crucifix here, but if you've been watching our star map stuff, what we have here is the Northern Cross, otherwise known as Cygnus constellation. And yeah, so Nevern sits right at the center of it. Definitely seems to be. I just don't know what to say about this. I think it's absolutely amazing.
It is.
They've put the cross in the cross.
They put the cross in the cross, and Wilson and Blackett certainly believe that Helen as well buried herself somewhere near where the feet of someone on the cross would be.
Right.
But yeah, this is part of the West Wales zodiac. This is probably the one that, from my overview of what we know about zodiacs and what the work Wilson and Blackett did, I think this is the one we know the least about, the West Wales zodiac. We're hoping to talk to Steve Willits on Sunday about his work on the Southeast Wales one, which will be absolutely fantastic.
Fascinating.
Can't wait to do. Wilson Blackett did work on 2 zodiacs, and the other one's here in West Wales. And as I say, this is Cygnus. So what else there is in West Wales that we've yet to discover? I mean, it's very exciting.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I'm still
maybe I was going to say maybe someone enterprising with this bit of data might be able to extrapolate outwards and find some more of that star map. Not me. I'm not technically minded enough. Maybe one day when I've learned a bit more, but I'm good at scanning maps for interesting things, though. I can do that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Dab hand with the LiDAR.
Yeah, absolutely. I can do that bit. So if someone wants me to look for something in a certain area, I can do that. But as for working out where stars could be, I'm not there. I'm not there yet.
No, I think that takes a special kind of mind, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
One I don't have, I think.
And when we were talking to Martin and Steve, who've both been working on their bits for years and years and years. So I think Steve said he's been working on it for 6 years, and he had the advantage of starting with Wilson and Blackett. So
quite the privilege.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's really cool. It was great to have him on the show.
Yeah, really looking forward to that.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if you can see that there, but here's a depiction which is in Holy Kingdom of a depiction. It's the picture of the constellation of Cygnus in 1660.
Okay.
By Andreas Cellarius. Sure. Thanks for Peter sending me that. That's really good. But a point which Wilson and Blackett emphasises is very important, and they're quite right to, is which we talked about before, is the dectrals of Constantine and their forgery, which basically the bishops attempt to wield power from the death of Constantine. So in the later days of the empire, essentially, these people were looking for a way to carry on an empire through the church, is essentially what happened as well. And that's what happened there, and that's when the church became a instrument of power, essentially. So that's a very important crux point for the development of Western culture, I think. And this is the kind of thing which German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche talks a lot about the priestly caste and the acquisition of power through abstract means, so they can become the drivers of culture and the directors of culture through wielding power in a kind of priestly and abstract way.
Interesting.
Yeah,
that's very cool.
Something I've just remembered, which I came across recently, was a discussion about trying to clarify which type of Christianity Constantine followed, because there seems to be a difference of view in what his last rites were at the end. We have a story that right at the very end he finally came to Christianity and acceded to the Roman Church, as it were. So that's a narrative that's given out. But I've heard another story to say that he asked for an Arian Christian rite at the end, which would be in the face of it. So
that wouldn't go down well with a lot of people, would it?
Absolutely. So there seems to be the memory of some kind of contention there about what type he wanted to put his, let's say, commit his faith to at the end. I've heard there was another interesting plan that he might have had, which was he wished to have been buried in Constantinople, and I think there were plans for a massive, the word escapes me now, but a huge grave, basically a temple in which his tombstone would have been placed central, and the plan was to try and get the remnants of as many of the apostles as he possibly could to be housed with him in the center, as it were, and with those circling around him. That was a plan that he wished, but that was dismantled in that sense after his death, and when other interested parties were shaping things. So it was a lost plan, and I think fragments of that layout or plan can be found in Istanbul.
Yeah. So going back quickly to the cross issue, it would indicate then that cross symbolism is something which is inherent to the a kind of spiritual tradition in Britain, and it's certainly something which some Freemasons argue. So Manly P. Hall, famous Freemason author, talks about the Tau cross, and basically there's this idea which it was a symbol of Hugh Godon, or Hugh the Mighty, who came to Britain. I think he's more associated with the Albion migration to Britain, and so that there's an ancient representation of the cross here. And if you look at the left here, this is on the Tristan stone, and that version of the Tau cross is here, which is this kind of T shape, which it doesn't go all the way up like a
Okay.
traditional cross, but it is a cross image which is in Britain. But then we do get these Tau row crosses, which appear later on. This one, I know this is we can only conjecture actually to this, but you can argue that it brings the dating back, or you can argue that it was given later on, carved later on. But this cross is a representation of the Tau cross in Britain, which represents, I feel, an early apostolic Christianity in Britain, given that seeing as if we're meant to be getting Christianity way later than is usually said, we'd be saying the Chi cross a lot more, which is actually something. It's similar because it's got the P shape, but it's actually cross on its side, which I've demonstrated before. But we get the Tau cross appear here as well. This kind of thing, which I think you can, when you look at some other crosses in Cornwall, for example, in modern depictions, you get this depiction of a human Christ given with a whole face and a body, but just with arms out like that, which is possibly what's happening here. And if you want to go and see how this stone is decoded and the hidden messages within that, you can kind of see our channel, the Bardic Code, which I'll give a link to, which goes into this thing. But it talks about how this stone, which is called Principe, is in Cornwall, and how it's
Devon.
Sorry,
get it right.
It's in. Jeez, in Devon. Sorry. How
the Drostana stone is in Cornwall, and the middle one is in Devon. Yeah.
Excellent, great. And we're close to the home of this narrative of Jesus coming to Britain is very associated with that part of the country, and we've got this stone saying Principe. So go and have a check that out if you haven't already.
I've got a little tiny update on that for those who have seen the video, and for those that haven't, go back, and then come back and unpause. I talked about the slight contention about the name Avdeti. The general consensus is that it represents the word audentious, the name audentious, which has a certain meaning in Latin. I've seen versions of this where they reckon it actually says Avde, which means it is still used in Russian, which is like the Russian equivalent of the Greek Obadiah, which means God's servant. And I thought, well, we've got a bit. If there's a T there, we've got audentious, and if there isn't, we've got Obadiah or Avde. But actually, I was just on a website that was going. I was trying to really find some meaning in this word name audentious, and then it showed a Greek version of it, which is Ordeo.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Which is clearly the same name as Abde. So this website that was saying that audentious is a Latin name that means something, I don't think it is. I think it's from a Greek, from the same Greek root, meaning God's servant. So whether that says audentious or whether it says Avde or Avdeti, it still means the same thing as God's servant.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well done.
Great. Nice work. Fantastic. Right.
Just if I can go back, I wanted to add something on the Carausius stone. What's the date they've given for that ad?
I think it's 6th century. Yeah, 6th century.
Thank you. It is. It's quite late, isn't it?
Yeah.
And in that sense, it's not possibly thought to relate to Carausius, the emperor.
Yeah, that's right. That's the line it's given, and I've argued before that because of that cross, you could argue that it's earlier.
That's right, and in that sense, it's an early light on the fact that Christianity was present and that the Roman emperors were tied into it.
Yeah,
but also with the text, I've unpicked it, and it actually tells the narrative of Carausius and gives his exploits on the sea and his pirating. It actually says it when you take the text and read it in Welsh. So it is Carausius the Emperor, and we have that much earlier date that's now gettable because of it.
Nice work.
Okay.
Excellent. Yeah, fantastic. Iona is one of the very most important places we need to discuss when talking about what they call the Celtic Church, and it was a monastery which was incepted by an Irishman called Columba, and Columba was responsible for starting about 300 churches in Ireland, and he is also responsible for recording or handwriting hundreds of versions of the New Testament as well. So, you can argue that he's responsible for that many. There's probably way more versions of the New Testament disseminated around the British Isles. And
so this Columba is when I before I knew anything about Wilson and Blackett or Britain's hidden history, Columba is what I was introduced to as the beginning of Christianity in Great Britain after the Romans left.
Thank you. I had that at school as well.
Yeah.
Right. But what they didn't tell you is that he was schooled at Bangor Secoid.
No, they did not tell me that. No.
So,
and is it worth mentioning? Are we going to go on to Patrick, or can I talk about Patrick a little bit?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, only just that if you look in the right place, I found another good lecture about early Christianity in the British Isles, Great Britain and Ireland, and it was really good, and it goes into a much more detailed version of events. But the reason I was looking for that is because I've also seen a lot of other popular videos, which lots of people are watching, about the early Celtic Church, as they often call it, and they start with St. Patrick, and now Patrick had to come from somewhere, and I've seen also a couple of popular speakers as well saying that to get around the fact that Celtic Christianity needs to start in Ireland, they say, well, Patrick was a Roman.
Really?
Yes. Yeah.
And then leave it at that. They don't try and explain, what the hell was a Roman doing in Ireland in the 5th century? No one tries to understand that. Now, of course, we can say that Patrick was a Briton. He was probably of an aristocratic class, so therefore descended from Roman Britain aristocracy. That's about as close to a Roman as you can make him.
Absolutely.
He was schooled at Llaniltyd or whatever or the college that was there before Llaniltyd in roughly the same area in Llantwit Major. And there's no way that he was a Roman by any stretch of the imagination, as I say, only through this link through his culture and his ancestors. And that British Christianity came to Ireland, and what we can say happened there was the incredible fusion of cultures, which then created what we call Celtic Christianity today. And when we're talking about what was British Christianity at certain points of time, that Irish influence, in the 4th, 5th, and specifically in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, is something we can't ignore. And it brought an incredible richness to the visual aspect of church, and there was definitely a lot of intermingling of Brythonic and Irish ideas through the various invasions backwards and forwards in North Wales, in South Wales, in West Wales, in Cornwall, and it's an intercourse that cannot be denied between Ireland and Britain, but it seems like another step towards obscuring the origins of the British Church when we say that Celtic Christianity started with Patrick.
Yeah,
which just doesn't make sense in any way. You know, he didn't come out of the womb baptized.
Yeah.
He was born and raised into a Christian tradition in Britain.
Yeah,
and not in Rome as well.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, nice.
I think Baron Blackett wrote a small book on also, oh God, Patrick as well. And
yes, St. Patrick Revisited.
Yeah, and he has him having some training in South Wales, but also in Gaul too.
In Gaul, yeah.
So he certainly engaged in whatever the Christian thinking was at that time. So,
absolutely, and I just like any British saint from the period, from the 5th or 6th century, I'm not surprised to find them in Northern Gaul or Brittany.
No,
or, you know, or Northern Gaul, not even necessarily in Brittany. There's people moving all throughout the north of France.
Yes, yeah. I think Columba ends up in the south near those old Gnostic communities as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I
think Columba is recorded in Cornwall as well.
Fantastic.
Oh, or has church foundations. Yeah,
fantastic.
There's quite a few Irish saints have church foundations in Cornwall.
Yeah,
as well. Yeah,
not surprised.
But the again, the lives of the saints gives this impression of this was them spreading the mission, whereas there's something else going on with the time of the saints, the age of the saints. Something else is going on that's more than just about trying to. It's not about trying to convert people. It's there's something else going on.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah,
there's another motive involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We need to delve into the lives of the saints. I think that'd be great.
Adam, do you know how every day I resist from buying a big complete collection from a very nice Somerset book dealer?
Oh, really? Really? Yeah.
Sabine Baring-Gould's complete translations.
How much are we talking?
About 90 quid, I think, for all. Which is not bad actually, but then considering each one's only tiny, so. But yeah, I think it's about 100 quid.
Not surprised you're tempted. Yeah.
But absolutely.
We do well to have a look at that and tell those stories, I think.
Absolutely. And if I could just put in a little plug for someone, the Dartmoor podcast, who had me on to talk about the mining, he's done a little show. I'll send you the link. He's done a little video about the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould, who translated the lives of the saints, who's one of our local celebrities down here in Devon. He did tremendous wonders for the matter of Britain. He translated loads of the ancient texts from Latin and Welsh into English, so we can enjoy them. And he did a lot of work on ancient monuments and inscribed stones and things like that. So he's a real character that we should remember. And definitely go and watch that video, because he's an absolutely fascinating character and antiquarian that we should all know, especially when we're into this sort of stuff.
What I found interesting when looking at Columba and Iona is that King Oswald of Northumbria sent for someone from Iona to come and establish Lindisfarne and the monastic college there. So you can see there that there was an amicable kind of communication between Saxons wanting to become Christian and Christian people of the West British Isles and Ireland, and how that looks to be far more peaceful than the kind of story we're given usually between the relationship between Saxons and Britons and the Irish. But yeah, that was set up by St. Aidan, and so the story you can tell in contrast to that is Augustine coming to Britain and ordering the some Saxons in Kent to essentially massacre 1,200 monks in Bangor Coed. which is a terrible terrible thing, because what they didn't concede and submit to the authority of Rome, basically. Imagine you've got this monk come from Rome, and you've had a church for 600 years, and it's like, well, no.
Do we know if there's historical evidence of money pouring into the coffers of the Saxon kings from Rome?
I think I don't know if there's evidence, but I've heard that being spoken about before, actually, because they became they would become the mercenaries,
martial
which
arm.
would. Sorry?
Franks became the martial arm, didn't they?
The Franks
did, definitely did. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Franks did. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can see a similar, as you've already pointed out, a similar relationship between the Catholic Church and the Saxons as well.
Yes. So this tension between Saxons and Britons was exacerbated by the church, basically, in terms of, and it's all to do with religion. And as I've mentioned before, this is something which happened way into the Norman period, and which Edward I was also responsible for. All this division that we experience in the UK to do when it comes to the international relationships between England, Wales, and Scotland, I think you can trace back to the machinations of the church and the problems with the churches, to be honest. As you can see here, with King Oswald asking for Scottish, missionaries to come and teach them Christianity, without that problem, we probably would have had a far more united country, to be honest.
Interesting point.
Yeah. And another point to do with that is essentially what Iona did for the development of canon law, because the Ionians codified the first form of canon law ever, which is a tradition which had shaped the British Isles. Canon laws played a massive part in our culture and our development, and subsequently Western civilization as well. But this came out of Iona. This came out of people who were trained at Bangor Issicoid and this Celtic Church, essentially, which did a lot for the standardization of our lives. Thomas à Becket is a great story to do with how canon law is important, it essentially stops tyrants from being tyrants, and that came out of Iona. So that's I thought that was incredible.
Yeah, that is awesome.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting. I think the quality of things like the Book of Kells and the Book of Lindisfarne, as well, the Lindisfarne Gospel, show us how much is missing from Western Britain as well.
Yeah,
because documents like that do not appear in a vacuum. They appear as a part of a tradition and a practice. And as you've just shown, saints from the British Church came to the Saxons to teach them.
Yeah,
this tradition, it didn't come from Rome. And in fact, later on, we call it the insular tradition, which is meant to be a mix of the British Church and the Saxon Church, spreading out from Britain, across Western Europe, and becoming the standard in writing, studying. In artistry, it became the international standard and the best in the world. And as I say, that doesn't come out of nowhere. So that shows that when we look at someone like Gildas, who's writing in phenomenal Latin, and yet it's the only document.
Stylist.
And it's the only document from the time, then that shows that's evidence for what's missing. There must be a huge wealth of documents that would have been in Britain, and the Dark Ages, if they are to be called the Dark Ages because of a lack of recording, they are something that is man-made. And they have been made by the destruction of Brythonic Christian documents and anything related to over the course of 1,000 years by various people.
Fantastic. Yeah.
We're not saying all that. There could have been something. There must have been. because what we do have cannot have appeared out of nowhere.
Great point. Yeah, absolutely. And this whole myth about being barbarians is built on this lack of these documents, which were probably disposed of, probably burnt, probably gotten rid of for many
and say there's a number of events in history where this could have happened, and I'm not just talking about 1 year one Saxon king or one Norman king went through and annihilated everything. I'm talking about 1,000 years of destruction right up until and including the Reformation.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
And including, absolutely, yeah.
The Reformation probably would have been a big one. Like, really,
yeah.
Really, the death knell, if anything. The end of it. And now we've got what we got, which is unfortunately not very much.
Not a lot, yeah.
But it's enough to signpost us. It is enough to signpost us, definitely, in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's not all lost.
No.
Reuben
of Durand only needs. Oh
yeah. So essentially, we've spoken about St. Augustine, so I won't stay on this slide for long. But this is, as we've mentioned before, the official line of how Christianity came, which we've explained is rubbish, and
I like how Alan Wilson always calls him St. Austin.
Austin, yeah,
because I think that's how he's first recorded, as Austin, and obviously Augustine has been Latinized to make him sound a bit fancier and equate him with Augustine of Hippo, and Alan Wilson steadfastly refers to him as St. Austin.
This is, and that's it, right? Yeah, no, you are, mate. You're not anything more grandiose.
Nothing august about you.
No, exactly. You're literally someone who got mercenaries to massacre holy people. So yeah, you're not much of a saint, are you? Really? Ran over.
Call it.
Sorry.
Call it.
Yeah, call it. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Say it like it is. Yeah.
That's it. I mean, I think this is a really interesting moment in the church history in Britain, which is the Whitby Accords, basically. The Whitby meeting, synod. Sorry. A council between the apostolic Christians and the Catholics. And Peter mentioned earlier how it doesn't seem to be doesn't on the surface, when you look at what's presented to you, is that they're arguing over the date of Easter and how they had the haircut, which sounds completely ludicrous, because it was an event which is also described as being extremely contentious and completely fraught with kind of conflict. And this, you mentioned before how the tonsure could be an allusion to Simon Magus, so you can see that controversy there. But King Oswald eventually favors the favors the Roman argument due to the story of St. Peter, which would have, I feel, had the story of Simon of Magus tied in with it. So do you see what I mean? Because he said, okay, I want to go the Roman way because we've got this story of St. Peter, and I don't really want to go against the Book of Acts in that way. And the warning in the Book of Acts against Simon Magus. So this thing to do with Simon Magus, and so what I'm trying to say is that the haircut actually becomes symbolic of something far deeper than it appears on the surface, which is, I don't want to be associated with people who raise people from the dead, who idolize.
I thought Jesus did that.
Good point. I mean, I can't argue with that.
Just wanted to throw that one in.
Good point. That's great. Jesus the necromancer. Yeah. It's an interesting. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, that's it. This. So the representations of the people in the Celtic Church, so-called. I know I keep saying the word Celtic. People bear with me. It's how it's represented in. When you're studying it, so I'm just what I mean
Yeah,
by
or you
this,
can use the word insular, which I'm not really
all
happy
right.
about either, to be
No,
honest.
Saints
No,
don't get out much.
no.
Instead of I travel the world from this place.
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. So yeah, so you,
Sorry.
you're right.
So I'm just tickled.
Sorry, one
Where are
more.
we?
So where am I? This moment acts as the point in which England became more aligned with Rome,
Yeah.
Yes.
essentially because
It's the pivotal moment.
yeah, absolutely, and
Yeah.
it came down to essentially um, King Oswy, sorry, not Oswald, that was earlier, King Oswy, um, not wanting to overstep the church on the narrative of St. Peter and Simon Magus.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool, right. And that Oswy was mindful of the fact that St. Peter is said to hold the keys to heaven, essentially.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But the main differences between the British Church and the Roman Church at that point were, I think, quite, the whole thing about celibacy is quite deep, really, because the British ecclesiastics didn't believe in that. They believed in having a wife, and you couldn't really be involved in advising people unless they'd had that
Well,
life as well, had a
that
family.
follows the well the Jewish model in the sense of you weren't
Yes.
allowed to become a teacher, a father, a leader unless you'd shown that you were embedded in the community, had
Mm.
made your way in the world, had a family. You were completely in life and of it uh, before you were recognized as capable of being an advisor or a teacher.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's part of Wilson Blackett's point about
Yeah.
showing Jesus as a teacher, as a sorry, what was the word again?
Rabbi.
Rabbi, is
Rabbi.
it? Yeah.
Is that at the time certainly rabbi, you would have to be married to be a
Yeah.
rabbi.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Precisely.
yeah.
Precisely that. So
And also the openness of the female to be in the system in the sense of having duties
Absolutely.
and authorities too.
This is what I was just going to say.
Yeah, and for the position to fall in as a hereditary office, which I believe the Bardic structure was very similar to that too. You know,
mm,
your son and daughter could follow you in that sense in your office.
Yeah, you you get um, Lives of the Saints, which like to talk about some of the British princesses who became saints as living their life of saintly celibacy and stuff, and then later goes
yes.
on to say, "Oh well, but she also was the mother of this saint."
Right.
Good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
I think that's a great point. I think part of it is to do with obscuring the fact that the women would have had an active role in the
yeah,
church.
Mm.
yeah,
Not just talking about, British male priests marrying, but what about female British priests
Yeah.
marrying?
yeah, yeah.
And there's certainly descriptions about their communities, about them all living and eating and working together,
Mm.
men and women, which is really interesting. And the Saxon representatives getting very upset about it when they see it, and
Yeah.
so yeah, very very interesting point to make.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah, and the fact that the British Christians didn't believe that bishops had ultimate authority, which if you can, when you look at the power moves that they made to forge certain documents like Constantine's will and handing over the empire, you can see how that rubs them up the wrong way. This is entirely to do about power
Mm.
and certain power groups wielding power. And I think Christmas was celebrated on the 1st of March on St. David's Day, and Dewey is not the same as St. David, and
No.
Dewey means one with God, according to Wilson and Blackett. So Dewey could be another name for Christ in the Welsh tradition,
That's right.
Which is why the first of March was there. So the date of Easter and the date of Christmas are different for the British Church. Cool. And so, right, this was an interesting point, and I was delving into the early church meetings by the by church members across the Christian world. First one being the Council of Nicaea to establish the Nicene Creed, and so I was basically, my mission was to find out which ones British bishops actually attended and where Britain was actually represented. So Britain was represented in the Council of Nicaea. It was also in the Council of
Arles.
Thank you. My French tongue escaped me there.
Yeah, your grandmother won't be pleased.
No, that's right. She'll tell me off. So that wasn't one of the main church meetings, but it is a meeting that happened in France where British bishops attended. Right, and they were there at the Council of Constantinople as well. Interestingly, the last one that they did visit was one where they discussed Pelagianism and the risks of the Pelagian heresy.
Yep.
And then after that, they didn't attend any church meetings until the end of the 8th century.
What?
Yeah. And that second Council of Nicaea in 787. So we can see a threshold point in when Christianity in Britain was becoming more Romanized. And after that point, you see British bishops attending or being allowed to attend probably at the very end of the church meetings. And the Council of Ephesus being the one where they're discussing the problems that the British Church is throwing up probably. So very interesting point to add, I think.
And we can't just say that because the Romans left Britain, that's why they didn't attend church meetings, because this is 20 years after.
Yeah.
So there's definitely continuity into the 5th century with the church in Britain, and they're still attending. And it seems to be that they got annoyed because of the discussion of Pelagianism.
So jumping forward quite a lot. I wanted
first.
Sorry.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So jumping forward quite a lot. Just wanted to talk about the implications of this church, I feel, for the Reformation, and the break with Rome, basically, and what happened under the Tudors with the Protestant Reformation. So I seem to remember that Henry VIII made that break and cited his ancestry as an element which he can use for legitimating that move. Can't find any evidence for that, but I can.
I've got evidence for it.
All right, great.
I haven't shown it yet, but I've taken apart one of Henry VIII's coins. Okay, it's Latin, but obviously, if it's Latin, you can break it and down into the Welsh as well. The discussion about the early churches there, it's encoded.
Brilliant. Oh, that's interesting.
It is there.
Oh, look, Queen Elizabeth has gone with Alan Wilson. Long after that went Austin, and then St. Augustine has to be put in square brackets.
Yes.
She's not even going to call him a saint. When Austin turned up. Brilliant.
Ooh, when Austin turned up. That prick. Yeah.
Bit like the old car, isn't it? Outside, not getting any attention. The old Austin.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, I hadn't noticed that, but that's spot on, isn't it? With the brackets. Wow.
Austin. Yeah, absolutely. We should call him Austin from now on.
Austin, right.
Austin,
yeah. So yes. So this is an extract from a letter that Queen Elizabeth wrote in reply to Catholic bishops, probably pleading for her to turn back to Catholicism. And And I'll read it out because it is good. It's not that long.
Mm.
So, sirs, as to your entreaty for us to listen to you, we waive it. Yet do return you this our answer. Our Roman subjects have been long wanderers, walking astray, whilst they were under the tuition of Romish pastors, who advised them to own a wolf for their head in lieu of a careful shepherd, whose inventions, heresies, and schisms be so numerous that the flock of Christ have fed upon poisonous shrubs for want of wholesome pastures. And whereas you hit us and our subjects in the teeth, that the Romish Church first planted the Catholic faith within our realms, the records and chronicles of our realms testify the contrary, and your own Romish idolatry maketh you liars. Witness the ancient monument of Gildas, unto which both foreign and domestic have gone in pilgrimage there to offer. This author testifieth Joseph of Arimathea to be the first preacher of the word of God within our realms. Long after that, when St. Augustine, came to Rome, this our realm had bishops and priests therein, and is well known to the wise and learned of our realm by woeful experience how your church entered therein by blood, they being martyrs of Christ and put to death because they denied Rome's usurped authority. Quite the response, quite authoritative, and it's not pulling any punches in terms of
No,
the
calling it.
ancient British narrative and how we understand it. So, yeah, I think this is interesting because it means that at the beginning of this Tudor break from Rome, or the dawning period of it, really, of the Reformation and everything, they're not apologizing that, or Elizabeth isn't apologizing for the fact that Britain had a Christianity before Rome. But yet, when you ask Anglican priests now about the authenticity of Joseph of Arimathea and the early church, there's a lot of denial there, and a lot of.
I've watched a couple of lectures in that sense, or talks, and I've heard the put down from Anglican clergymen.
Yeah.
In regard to considering the reality of an early British church.
Mm.
Literally, it's put again in the film in the realm of fairy tale.
Yeah, absolutely. But
So,
yeah, I mean, but then when you go to Anglicans in America, you see quite a few Anglicans in America totally support the old British narrative.
I've seen that too.
It seems like there's a kind of curse in Britain where you can't talk about it, or you shouldn't talk about it. It's completely un-PC.
It's a good point.
So yeah, cool. And I'll just touch on this briefly about what I think the implications are of studying the early British Church were for the British, well, the call it the British Civil War, because that's what it was. In that certain Protestants were influenced by Arminianism, which has been described as Pelagianism or semi-Pelagianism.
Okay.
So there were certain, I mean, when you look at the English Civil War and see how many sects there are of religious direction, it's like infinite. But many of them were interested in mysticism. Many of them were interested in the Kabbalah and a lot of the old Jewish stuff, which is a big driving force behind the readmission of the Jews into England, to essentially incept a college in London where people could go there and learn the old Jewish stuff, to the Jewish mystic stuff. And
isn't it interesting also at this point? This is when witch finders are in operation in great number.
Right.
And now witch finders they were given, should we say, they were allowed passage by both sides on the Civil War. Yeah. So they were allowed to act sort of almost outside of the political arena. But they were largely paid for by the church and the king.
Yeah.
And the sort of things that you're talking about is definitely the sort of thing that a witchfinder would be interested in and looking at. And I think this is really interesting to come back to this friction or lack of between Christianity and paganism, especially in this country, is that and I've spoken to Adam about this before, we are always told this story of a dichotomy between paganism and Christianity, and that the reason we don't have paganism in this country anymore is because of Christianity.
Yeah.
Whereas I think really there is a much greater political and power push, which meant that certain religious ideas went under, religious ideas which were associated with a different political affiliation.
Yeah.
So and the Reformation, the Reformation is probably the greatest destruction of Christian monuments in Britain, and it was done by Christians. The same goes in France. A lot of French churches and stuff only go back a few hundred years, because they had the war of religion, which was an absolutely terrible crisis between Protestantism and Catholicism in France, which saw terrible massacres and destruction, incredible destruction of religious sites. So we need to be careful about when we just can't make a generalization such as Christianity and a generalization as such as paganism and say, this squash this one. No. We're talking about thousands of years of possibly erosion of pagan ideas, and actually a lot of them were brought through into through Christianity, and through the British Church as well. And unfortunately,
a porous situation.
And really lost, disappeared because of a standardization of Christianity, whether you can call that Catholic or Anglican or whatever. Or we can also talk about how Henry's Anglican Church represented the Catholic Church.
Yes.
It was resembled the Catholic Church in many ways. And so, we should be careful not to just be like, Christianity eradicated paganism. Actually, there's a whole lots of other things at play to do with, as I say, to do with power, to do religion as well, but to do with power and to do with money. Money's always a driving force, but particularly power. How people worship, where that worshipping is done, what language they do it in. These are all methods of control, and I think that's really what we're looking about, is groups trying to control each other, and we should just be careful of these old polarities that we're given as they're just stories to help us maybe understand history better, but in the long run they actually obscure the more complex reality of things.
Precisely. Yeah. Brilliant. There we have it. I hope you enjoyed that episode, and please feel free to open any discussion in the comment section. I will aim to provide more insights on this topic in the future. If there's anything you feel I've missed, please let me know. And many thanks, and until next time.